Good morning and welcome. I'm Baron Bozeman, president of the Collin County Master Gardeners Association, and we are so proud that we have been able to bring you the spectacular speaker series this summer. I am joined by Brad Voss, the Collin County Master Gardener Extension Agent, Edie Fife, our immediate past president and 2022 Outstanding Master Gardener here in Texas, Program Chair Joyce Warren, and the Speakers Bureau Co-Chair Lisa McNeil. And then there's Jenny Nelson, our colleague who proposed this series and is the driver that has made this happen. I would also like to thank our communications team, Sarah Elliott and Sarah Dodd, for their help with the promotions. And a big thank you goes out to our friends at the Tarrant County Master Gardener Association for their technical and moral support with this series. Guys, it would not have happened without you. We would also like to thank the Tarrant County Water District for their support of AgriLife educational programs. I have a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to mention for you guys. As with all webinars, your video and microphones and chat functions are turned off. However, you will still be able to enter your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and they will be addressed as time allows. We do ask that your questions be directly related to Dr. Tallamy's discussion. I do want to point out that within the next week, we will be sending out a link which will allow you to access Dr. Tallamy's presentation, and that will last for about a 2-week period of time. We will also send out a survey that will help us improve future webinars. And so without further ado, I would like to invite Joyce Warren to introduce Dr. Tallamy.
Thank you, Baron. Thank you for joining us today for Doug Tallamy, the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 112 research publications and taught insect-related courses for 42 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His books include Bringing Nature Home, The Living Landscape, co-authored with Rick Dark, Nature's Best Hope, a New York Times bestseller, The Nature of Oaks, winner of the American Horticultural Society's 2022 Book Award. In 2021, he co-founded Homegrown National Park with Michelle Alfandari, homegrownnationalpark.org. His awards include recognition from the Garden Writers Association, Audubon, the National Wildlife Federation, Allegheny College, Eco-Foresters, the Garden Club of America, and the American Horticultural Association. And now let's hear from Dr. Tallamy.
Thank you, Joyce. Well, let's talk about Homegrown National Park and how it's going to help us build networks that will support life wherever we are. But before we do that, let's look at this thing. Looks like a fecal sac. You know, when birds are in a nest, they don't want their babies to poop in the nest, so the babies create a fecal sac that is easily picked up, and the parents take it away and drop it, usually on a leaf someplace. And it looks an awful lot like this, but that's not a fecal sac. It's actually a spider that sits on top of the leaf during the day. Here are the legs all curled around. But at night, it hangs from the leaf and looks a lot like a spider. It's the bola spider. It does not hunt with a net. It hunts with a single strand of silk with one sticky glob of glue at the end there. And moths fly in and get stuck on that glue, and the spider rapidly spins them around and wraps them all up in silk, and then has a very nice meal. Then she'll cut them loose and do it again, and she'll do it again and again until she has enough energy to create a egg mass. There are eggs. This is how the spider overwinters, in this egg sac. And if she is really lucky in her hunting, she'll make 2 or 3 egg sacs, and then they spend the winter and hatch out the next spring. So you might wonder why moths are flying into this one sticky glob. It seems like a spider web would be a much better way to catch them, but they're not flying there by accident. It turns out that she is releasing the sex pheromone of particular species of moths. And it's always a male that flies in because he thinks she's a female. She is a female, but she's the wrong species. So they fly in. I was interested in what species of moth the bola spider was attracting in my yard. So I unwound the little bodies that she cut loose and found out it's the bronze cutworm. Every single bola spider moth that I have found in years at my house is the bronze cutworm. And I have bronze cutworm adults because I've got bronze cutworm larvae. And I've got bronze cutworm larvae because I've got their host plants, but primarily goldenrod. I also have the dot line white, a beautiful moth, because I've got oak trees, especially white oaks. They love white oaks, and because I don't rake the leaves away from underneath those trees. There is a dot line white cocoon in this leaf litter. And believe me, you would not see it when you're raking leaves. It's right there. There it is enlarged. It's really just this white sac on a leaf. So it's one of the reasons that we should not rake our leaves away from our trees. There's an awful lot of creatures that are hiding in those leaves. I had the evening primrose moth because I planted evening primrose. And the moth comes and it spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded in there, but it's always very cute. I have the zebra swallowtail because I've got pawpaws, and I've got pawpaws because I planted them specifically to attract the zebra swallowtail. It would take me a long time, a week, who knows how long, to describe all of the species interactions that are happening at my house. It would not take me a long time to describe what's happening in a typical residential landscape like this. There is no goldenrod, so there are no bronze cutworms, so there are no bola spiders. There are no oaks, so there's no dot line whites. There's no evening primrose, so there's no evening primrose moth. There's no pawpaws, so there's no zebra swallowtail. There is very little that can live in a typical residential landscape in this country, and we've got 135 million acres of typical residential landscapes that look just like this. And it's one of the reasons that we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here, talking about global insect decline. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. 2/3 of Earth's wildlife is already gone. The UN says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years. 40% of Earth's plants face extinction. Unfortunately, there is a whole litany of these terrible headlines that we're seeing on a regular basis. And that's why Elizabeth Kolbert gets to write The Sixth Extinction, talking about the sixth great extinction event that the planet has ever experienced. But of course, this is the only one that's been caused by a living creature. Well, a lot of people are upset about this, and so much so that people are studying what our reaction to biodiversity losses actually our reactions are. And one of the guys doing that is Richard Hobbs. He wrote this paper. He likens our response to bad news about biodiversity as being very similar to the 5 stages of grief that we experience when we hear we have a terminal disease. First, there's denial, and we certainly have a lot of denial out there that don't really have a problem. Anger, I've experienced that a little bit. Bargaining, what can we do to make it better? Depression, that's got to fight that all the time. Then the 5th stage is acceptance. And this is where I'm going to push back, because acceptance is the same thing as giving up. And giving up's not an option in this regard, because nature is not optional. Nature is what keeps us alive on this planet. So I'm going to propose a 6th response, and that is action. Now, we do have parks, we do have preserves. Our national parks were established primarily to preserve their exquisite beauty. And Teddy Roosevelt had a lot to do with expanding the national park system. He created the National Park Service, and he had this to say about it. The establishment of the National Park Service is justified by considerations of good administration. So Teddy's patting himself on the back, and he should have. Of the value of natural beauty as a national asset, and of the effectiveness of outdoor life and recreation in the production of good citizenship. In other words, our national parks were established because they were pretty places for us to play in. They were not established with conservation in mind. And that's one of the reasons we only have 3.6% of the US in the national park system. Only 12% is federally protected. And these are these dark green areas, a little bit of places like this. What's happening outside of those protected areas, of course, is appalling. Every 30 seconds, a football field worth of America's natural areas disappears to development. Development's the most oxymoronic word in all of ecology. 44 million acres of lawn. That's the latest figure I've seen. That's an area greater than the size of all of New England. We have paved over an area larger than Ohio, and that statistic is at least 15 years old, so who knows how much it is now. 2 million acres of golf courses. That's an area larger than Rhode Island and Delaware combined, dedicated to golf. Now, we do have parks and we do have preserves. And people are wondering, why aren't they enough to sustain the biodiversity that we all love and need? And the answer, there's actually several reasons they're not enough, but the big one is they're too small. When you take a large area like this and you shrink it down into a little fragment of its former self, you're taking large populations and shrinking them down to small or tiny populations, and that is the problem. Small populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why? Because all populations fluctuate. In good times, they go up, and bad times, they go down. If you're a large population, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals so you can increase quickly when times get better. But if you're a tiny population in these normal fluctuations, you often hit zero. You blink out of your little habitat patch, and unless you recolonize it, and that's hard these days, picture a box turtle crossing a major highway, it just doesn't happen, then you're permanently extinct. That's called local extinction. And it turns out that studies all over the planet, and some of them quite long, more than 100 years in length, are saying the same thing. The natural areas we have left on planet Earth are not large enough to sustain the amount of nature that we need. Because again, it is nature that keeps us alive on this planet. Now, we tend to use extinction as a measure of ecological trouble, but I don't like that, because it's like going to the doctor when you're already dead. It's better to look at the decline of populations that were once very common. This is the American chestnut. Used to be the dominant tree along the crest of the Appalachians from Maine all the way to Georgia. It's not extinct, but it is functionally extinct. I mean, it of course got wiped out by the chestnut blight, and there are little, sprouts that come up from rootstocks. So you can go out and you can find a chestnut, but it's not doing the job that it once did. This is the rusty patch bumblebee. Not long ago, it was one of the most common bumblebees in the entire country. Now, if you find one, it is a big deal because it is on the brink of actual extinction, but it's already locally or functionally extinct. They're not common enough to perform the role they used to play. Beavers. Now, beavers aren't extinct. They actually are making a comeback, but compared to the beaver populations that were here when Europeans came and essentially trapped them all out, they're very, very small. They controlled the hydrology of the entire country in really important ways. And when we removed the beavers, it changed the hydrology of the entire country. And we'll talk about how, particularly in the Southwest, in a little bit. So we're really talking about defaunation as the problem, not extinction, but defaunation, the reduction in the abundance of what was once common species. It's a very real problem. It's local. I mean, think about, just go out into anybody's front yard and look around at the life that's there. It's just a tiny fraction of what used to be there. So it's local, it's everywhere, and we tend not to notice it. We tend not to notice it because of what we call shifting baseline. We think that the way things were when we were growing up is the way they ought to be, the way they've always been. It's normal for us. So if we're born into a world that doesn't have a lot of biological diversity, we think that's normal, and we don't miss it. None of us missed the passenger pigeon, which was gone before any of us were born. It used to be the most common bird on the entire planet. So shifting baseline means that we are losing biodiversity. We're losing the biodiversity that sustains us, and we don't even notice it. So what are we going to do? Well, the UN's involved now. They had a big meeting last year in Montreal. You know what the UN does? They get together and they talk and they make resolutions. This is a headline from that meeting, talking about the biodiversity crisis. Crucial negotiations to protect biodiversity are moving at a snail's pace. We are negotiating about whether or not we're going to protect the stuff that keeps us alive on this planet. So good. I'm looking forward to their resolutions, but they made resolutions 20 years ago. We didn't meet any of them. So I'm not too hopeful about that solving the problem. E.O. Wilson had a lot to say about saving biodiversity, saving life on planet Earth. And he wrote this book in 2016, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, if we're going to save biodiversity anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. And then he ended the book. He did not spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save life on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a great idea. Let's just put half the Earth aside, and all the creatures that are disappearing can be in that half, and will be in the other half. The problem is half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. I don't see us getting rid of that soon. And we got 8 billion people with all of our hardscape, detritus, airports, everything else in the other half. And we don't have a third half. Get out of here. We don't have a third half, a third Earth to put aside for nature. So people are wondering how we can actually do that. Well, I think we can realize E.O. Wilson's dream, but we need a new approach to conservation in order to do that. We've had this idea that humans and nature cannot coexist, and it's a very old idea, but we got to give that up because not only can we coexist, not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. So we have to start thinking that way. Now, in the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's just about everywhere. So not only are we going to practice conservation here, we've got to practice conservation here, but it's all gone from here. So we have to move into restoration. We've got to restore it in landscapes just like this. And that means we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, but thrive. So this is the problem, fragmentation. We do have viable habitats out there, but they are isolated from each other. They're small. And there's not very many of them. So the proposal is we're going to build biological corridors that connect them so that plants and animals can move back and forth between these viable habitats. And that is a great first step. The problem in my view, though, is that the viable habitats are still small, which means the populations within them are still small. And when they fluctuate, they will still disappear. So I think we have to go beyond that. We've got to create viable habitats outside of these parks and preserves. This is good. That's even better. The lighter areas here would be where our cities and much of our agriculture is. But on all of this private property here, we've got to create habitat that can support the life around us, or it's going to disappear. To achieve this, though, we need to create a new attitude about property rights. You know, we've got this idea, we own a piece of the earth, it's ours to do whatever we want with because we own it. So we won't even talk about, you know, the morality of that, but I want to remind you that our properties, our yards are not like Las Vegas. You know what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, but what happens on our yards does not stay on our yards. And that's the problem. Our properties are all part of local ecosystems. So whatever we do on our property is either going to positively impact that ecosystem or negatively impact it, and therefore impact everybody around you and all the creatures and plants around you. Let's just talk about our decisions revolving around lawn. What will that do to local ecosystems? Well, the amount of lawn you have is going to determine whether rain infiltrates or whether it leaves a stormwater runoff. And it's going to determine whether we're adding nitrogen and phosphorus and herbicides and insecticides and other pollutants to our watershed when you get that stormwater runoff. It's also going to determine how much carbon we are adding to the atmosphere every time we mow it with our gas-powered mowers. All of that by our decisions of how much area of our property is lawn. How much lawn you have is going to determine whether you're supporting pollinators or not, or whether you're eliminating the resources they depend on. How we landscape is going to determine how much carbon our plants are pulling out of the atmosphere, not adding to it, but pulling out, building their tissues out of that carbon, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their root systems. And once it's in the ground, of course, it's very stable. Our plant choices are going to determine whether we're harboring ecological tumors, these invasive species like Callery pear, that escape our gardens and push out the important plants in our ecosystems and replace them with these non-native invasives. And plant choice is going to determine whether or not our properties are actually creating the insects that run the food webs around us, so that we can other creatures. That all comes down to plant choice. So in short, how we landscape is going to determine how much life the earth around us can sustain, the carrying capacity. And that is an awesome responsibility. And it's an awesome responsibility that homeowners don't know they have. But it also creates a grassroots solution to the biodiversity crisis, or at least an important part of the solution, because it has the potential of enlisting millions and millions of property owners. Most of the country is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. I think the figure's up in the 90-something% of Texas is privately owned. So what the private landowner does is going to determine what conservation looks like in the future. Property owners are the hope in the future of conservation. And again, they don't know that. Let's return to lawn. Lawn is the low-hanging fruit that I've been talking about for years now. This figure just keeps going up. There's somewhere around 44 million acres of lawn nationwide. And of course, we have lawn because it's a status symbol and because we've got to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we cut that area of lawn in half? Let's make the math simple. Let's say we've got 40 million acres. We cut that in half. That would give us 20 million acres that we can use to create homegrown national park. We can restore 20 million acres of lawn right at home and create a new national park. That will be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badland National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. Now, I had this idea way back when I first heard that statistic, probably around 2006, and I started talking about it in my talks. But I didn't write about it until I wrote Nature's Best Hope, and then I dedicated a chapter to building Homegrown National Park. But that's all I did. I just talked. Talk is cheap. Until I met a woman named Michelle Alfandari. Now, she's interesting because she's a stereotypical member of what we call the non-choir. People always say, you only talk to the choir, people who already agree with you. I said, well, it's only the choir that invites me. But Michelle had just retired from a licensing career in Manhattan. She knew nothing about nature. Didn't, if you don't know about it, you don't care about it. But she retired and she moved with her husband to Connecticut. And her neighbor said, I want you to come to this talk. I was giving a talk up there and kind of dragged Michelle to the talk. But she saw it as a challenge. She came up to me afterwards and she said, you're not reaching your target audience. And I said, I know, but she said, you got to do social media and you got to do this and that and marketing and everything else. And I said, I don't do any of that stuff. And she said, I do that stuff. So let's create a new nonprofit that we're calling homegrownnationalpark.org. And we have done that. It's just a little bit more than 2 years old at this point. The object is to entice people to register their properties on the map. And so the location and the amount of area that you're going to commit to being a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to cut the area of lawn in half or reduce the area of lawn by something. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. Doesn't matter how much land you're talking about, but you put that information in our database and your little piece of your county is going to light up. And you get to see everybody else in your county who's participating. It's free, by the way. So the object is to get the entire map to light up. We want to take the preserved map area that you see here and turn it into that through Homegrown National Park. What are we asking? We really are asking people to reduce the area of lawn. Lawn doesn't accomplish any of the ecological goals that all landscapes are responsible for, and we'll talk about them in a minute. And we're going to do that by replacing lawn with the native plants that do accomplish those goals. We want to remove invasive plants from our properties. Almost everybody does have invasive plants on their property, and they don't even know it. And if you're already protecting some natural area, you certainly want to keep doing that. Now, there are real ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park. One is a significant increase in biodiversity, and I'll give you some examples in a few minutes. Measurable reduction in invasive species. So if the entire country, or let's say Texas 90-some% privately owned, if everybody got rid of the invasives just on their property, we'd be 90-some% done in Texas. And that's true all over. Significant drawdown in atmospheric CO2. When you replace lawn with the plants that actually sequester carbon and pump it into the ground, you are helping climate change. And you're also creating viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. And every bit of conservation we do outside of parks helps conservation inside of those parks. There are real sociological products as well. National awareness, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are and our roles in those solutions. We are trying to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's not just there for our entertainment. It's essential. And because it's essential for everybody, everybody owns responsibility in sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action is better. And we want to merge existing national conservation efforts like Audubon or National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones, excuse me, all the Land Conservancy. We want to get them all on the map. And we can do that because we don't charge. We're not pulling membership away from anybody. We just want to encourage everybody to get the good conservation they're doing on private property registered on the map. And then we can see how well we're doing, what the progress is towards the 30-30 initiative, saving 30% of the US by 2030. Sorry, I have to take a drink here. There's no way we're going to save 30% of the US by 2030 if we don't include conservation on private property. There's urgency to enacting the Homegrown National Park solution. There are 135 million acres in residential landscapes out there. That is a big job, so we all need to get to work. And there's a few things we need to understand in order to be successful. And these are those things. Every landscape has to do 4 things. It's got to support viable food webs. It's got to sequester carbon. It's got to manage the watershed in which it lies, and it's got to support pollinators. The key is lawn does none of those things. That's why we talk about reducing the area that's in lawn. Plant choice is essential. So the plants we include on our property are going to determine how functional that property is. There are 3 kinds of plants out there. There are contributors, plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that actively remove energy from local food webs. Best example of a contributor would be one of our oaks, 91 species of oaks in North America, and they are the top contributor of energy into local food webs in 84% of the counties in which they occur. Good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo or any of the ornamentals from Asia. Ginkgo's a nice ornamental plant and nice yellow in the fall, but nothing eats a ginkgo. So it's not adding any energy into the food web. And then finally, a good example of a detractor would be, again, any of the invasive ornamentals is bamboo. But there's a lot of them that escape our gardens, replace the native plants, push out the native plants that are contributing energy with plants that are not. We need to appreciate, and this would be a new appreciation, how important caterpillars are in local food webs. Now, gardeners over the centuries have always been out to kill all the caterpillars they could find. The caterpillars have been their enemies. Well, caterpillars are not our enemies. They are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. They are the bread and butter of local terrestrial food webs. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. Therefore, the plants that make the most caterpillars turn out to be really important plants. I'm calling them keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is? It's the stone in the middle of the Roman arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they're making most of the caterpillar food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that support that house. They're the support structures. They're essential. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. If you want to find out what the best keystone plants are where you live, go to Native Plant Finder, the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the best keystone plants, both woody and herbaceous plant genera in your county, will pop up for you. This is just a sample list. It's much bigger than this when you actually look at it. So the old, we used to say, well, we don't know what the best plants are. We do know what the best plants are. So go to this list and find out. We have to much more thoroughly internalize the wonderful things that E.O. Wilson told us. And one of the most important things he told us is that insects are the little things that run the world. And we are losing our insects. Can't afford to do that. And if we're going to support the insects, we have to start with the insects that depend on plants, the insect herbivores. And we have to realize that 90% of them can only eat particular plants. 90% of them are supporting local food webs because they're developing on the plants that they co-evolved with. It takes a long period of evolutionary history with particular plant lineages to develop the adaptations necessary to get around the plant defenses. All plants defend themselves. They don't want to be eaten. And once the insect has come up with those adaptations, it's locked into eating that particular plant. The monarch butterfly illustrates this relationship perfectly. It is not an exception. It is the rule, as a matter of fact. But we all know that monarchs are host plant specialists on milkweed. And most of us know that milkweeds are toxic plants. They are filled with cardiac glycosides, which is why we don't eat milkweeds. If you eat enough milkweeds, your heart will stop. And you don't want that to happen. They're also loaded with sticky latex sap. When that's exposed to air, so let's say a caterpillar is eating a leaf, this white goo comes out. Well, when it's exposed to air, it gels. It becomes like chewing gum, and it glues the caterpillar's mouth part shut. Well, monarchs can eat milkweeds because they've got physiological adaptations that get around those chemical defenses, and they've got behavioral adaptations that block the flow of the sticky latex sap. So they're adapted to eating that particular plant, but now it's the only plant they can eat. And remember, 90% of the insects that are out there have specialized relationships with particular plants, just like the monarch butterfly. That's become common knowledge that we need pollinators. Now, we're doing pretty well here. Most people get it that we need pollinators. They're usually thinking about the honeybee, but we've got 4,000 species of native bees. And if you say, why do we need pollinators? They will tell you what they've heard from the media. We need pollinators because they pollinate a third of our crops. Well, no, they pollinate about a 12th of our crops. And we need pollinators everywhere, not just in agriculture. This is more important than our crops. They're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we would lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, and that is not an option. We want to realize how important leaf litter is. We talked about the dot line white hiding in the leaves, but leaf litter does so many things. When the leaves fall from your trees, they contain the nutrients that tree used that year. And those nutrients have to return to the soil so the tree can use them again in the future. It's a closed nutrient cycle. If we rake those leaves away, we've taken away the nutrients that your tree needs. And if you do that for 30 or 40 years, you're definitely going to starve your tree to death. They also form a blanket over the soil community. The soil community is extremely important. There are more species that live in the soil than above the soil, and they are breaking down the leaf litter, putting the nutrients back in the soil, and then transferring those nutrients to the roots of plants through the mycorrhizal fungal associations. And all of those creatures require high humidity, and that's what the leaf litter does. It protects the humidity in the soil, which is so important now, particularly in the age of climate change, where you got these brutal temperatures out there, drying out the soil, killing the soil community. We need to keep the leaves on site. Now you worry, well, gee, I can't keep leaves in my beds because my flowers won't be able to get through them. If you pile your leaves 5 feet thick, you're right, they won't. But a typical layer of leaf litters is not a problem for our ground covers. They can get through those leaves just fine. You just have to give them a chance to do that. We have to understand what's killing our insects, and one of the major causes of insect decline is light pollution. But fortunately, there is an easy solution to this. If you take nocturnal insects are not attracted to yellow wavelengths. So if we replaced the white bulbs in our outdoor lighting with yellow bulbs, overnight, we could save millions of insects. And if we use LEDs, we could save millions of dollars at the same time. We also have to understand what fogging for mosquitoes actually does. And the mosquito foggers, this is a booming business around the country for sure. And the mosquito foggers tells you it's okay because what we're fogging is a natural product. And it is a natural product. This pyrethroids, which is the product in chrysanthemums. And it's an insecticide in chrysanthemums that kills insects that try to eat chrysanthemums. So this is industrial strength chrysanthemums or pyrethroids. And they say it's okay because it's a natural product, but you know, cyanide is a natural product. Ricin is a natural product. Nature makes a lot of nasty natural products. So I don't think that's a good argument. They also say it only kills mosquitoes. Not even close to true. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with, which is all the insects. And that includes monarchs. This is the result of a mosquito fogging event on the eastern shore of Maryland. And I know you've had them in Texas as well. The interesting thing is it does not control mosquitoes. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage, you control them in the larval stage. It's too hard to control them in the adult stage. You have to kill 90% of them, and mosquito fogging kills between 10 and 50%. So the real way to control mosquitoes is in the larval stage, and we can use biological control using mosquito dunks. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put a handful of straw or hay in the bucket and put it out in the sun. It'll build up populations of diatoms and algae, and that is what mosquito larvae eat. So this becomes an irresistible brew to mosquito females that want to lay their eggs. They will go to your bucket and lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you get a sheet of mosquito dunks, $12. And this is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito larva. So it's extremely targeted. If a dragonfly gets in there, it doesn't hurt it a bit. If your dog drinks it, it doesn't hurt it a bit. You might put a coarse screen over your bucket so your local chipmunk doesn't jump in and drown, but it's targeted, it's cheap. If everybody did it, it would make a big difference. We want to start to appreciate that even our city folk can participate in conservation. Small properties can be very valuable. This is Pam Carlson's property in Chicago, right next to O'Hare Airport. She has 1/10 of an acre, which is 3 times smaller than the average lot size in the US. And when you landscape it in native plants, it becomes an important resource, far more than you might think. She's documented 124 bird species using her yard. So they are very effective. And if you don't have any space at all, we can move to container gardening, which will help our pollinators, our migrating monarchs, and essentially no yard at all. Even people with balconies and apartment complexes can landscape with native plants and help, particularly the mobile pollinators. Now, fortunately, we do have a silver bullet in our fight against climate change and biodiversity, the biodiversity crisis, and that is that conservation works. Nature is extremely resilient. This is the Nachusa grasslands in Illinois, 3,800 acres. There are now more than 730 native plant species there. 180 species of birds have been recorded here. It used to be a cornfield, and it didn't take that long. This is my house right here, our house. My wife always wants me to call it our house for some reason. This is what it looked like when we moved in. We got a 10-acre lot in Southeast Pennsylvania, had been farmed for over 300 or almost 300 years. Last thing they did was mow it for hay. When you mow for hay in Southeast Pennsylvania, you're really mowing the rootstocks of all the invasive plants that are there, Oriental bittersweet and multiflora rose and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle. And when you stop mowing, That's what comes back. So we actually ended up with 10 acres of Asian vines and prickly things. It was, it was a disaster. And that's discouraging to a lot of people. You really can't restore it till you get rid of those non-native plants, but it's not that hard. Just get your wife to do it. And that's what Cindy did. So it is a huge job. I don't want to minimize it, but she picked at it. She likes being outside. And I helped a little bit, but she did the bulk of it, showing that you really can get these things under control. And then you can put the plants back. And that's what we have been doing. Now, my research has shown that if you understand the number of moth species, not butterfly species, but moth species in your local food web, it's a very good index of the productivity of that food web and the stability of that food web. So for the last 6 years, I have been counting the moths that are now making a living on our property that used to be just this tangle of Asian vines. And I'm up to 1,224 species of moths. So far, I'm still doing it. Added another one 2 nights ago. And they're there because we put the plants back. Many of them are really interesting creatures, like the chinkapin leaf miner, the skullcap skeletonizer, the neighbor, the little devil, the horrid zally, the forgotten frigid owlet. What a great name that is. The scallop sallow, the obtuse yellow, the explicit arches, and yes, there's an implicit arches too. The snowy-shouldered eclaris, the grateful midget, the morbid owlet, the pink-shaded fern moth, the feeble grass moth, the scribbler, the lemon plagotis, the showy emerald, the green marvel, Harris's three-spot, the old wife in underwing, the eyed pectes, the tufted bird-dropping moth. Who wouldn't want the tufted bird-dropping moth on their property? This is my favorite, the spun glass caterpillar. What an exquisite example of adaptation. And then hundreds of other species have come to the plants we put on our property. And when I tell this story, people say, well, you got all those caterpillars, they're going to defoliate your property. Well, if I had nothing eating caterpillars, that might be the case. But there are many things eating those caterpillars, including birds. We have recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our property, not flew by, but bred, and they eat hundreds of caterpillars. Each one eats hundreds of caterpillars every day. We also have lots of insect predators out there. We've got ambush bugs, we've got assassin bugs, we've got predatory stink bugs. This is an aggregation of milkweed tussock moth. This guy sat next to this aggregation and he ate one every day. And there were a lot fewer by the time he was finished. A lot of hymenopteran parasitoids, wasps that lay their eggs in the caterpillars that are out there. Hundreds of those species. And we've got other wasps that will sting the caterpillar, paralyze it, and then they carry it off to their in this case, this is makes a little mud nest. They stuff it in the nest and they lay an egg on it. This is nature's refrigeration. There are no refrigerators in nature, but if you paralyze the caterpillar, it doesn't die, which means it doesn't start to rot. If you killed the caterpillar and laid an egg on it, it would be a rotten mess before the egg even hatched. And of course, lots of other things that are eating, not just caterpillars, but all the insects that are out there. Skunks, possums, raccoons all eat a ton of insects. Foxes, 25% of a red fox's diet is insects. And we've got amphibians eating insects like little tree frogs and toads and salamanders and ringneck snakes and the cutest little green, gray tree frogs. They're green when they're little, that you ever did see. All these things are on our property because we put the plants back and attracted all those insects. All right, that's pretty much the replace the lawn story, but our lawn goals are too modest because so much land is not in lawn. Most of the privately owned land that is out there is in small woodlots, it's in cropland, or it's in rangeland. Let's talk briefly about woodlots. 406 million acres of woodlots in the U.S. that are managed by private citizens, not logging companies. And when I say managed, they are managed for lumber. So how you do that, how you harvest that lumber, and how you control the invasive plant load in those woodlots is going to determine their biodiversity value. Now, we've learned a lot about sustainable forestry. This is the Foundation for Sustainable Forests in Western Pennsylvania, but there are other such organizations around the country. And what they tell us is this: there's two ways to harvest wood. You can have high grade harvesting, where you take the best trees, and worst first harvesting, where you take the worst trees and leave the best. With high grade harvesting, you get one good harvest once, then you got to wait 80 years or so to get another one. Worst first gives you smaller but more frequent harvest. You're leaving the best trees, so you can do it indefinitely without reducing the lumber value of your property. But again, these properties in just about all the places are highly invaded with plants, escapees from our garden. This is what a natural area near my house looks like. And all the green you see there is our ornamentals escaped from our gardens. About 30% of our natural areas are now plants from our gardens that are very poor at supporting local food webs. Now, the key to managing these plants, you'd think you just go out there and you kill all the invasives. The problem is deer. We've got overabundance of deer from coast to coast, and they push the competitive balance against our native plants. The deer don't like the non-natives any more than the insects do. So they eat the native plants. Every little oak that pops up, the deer eat it, and they don't touch the burning bush or the privet or the buckthorn or any of the other things. And you end up with an understory that's all non-native. So if you exclude the deer, you get to see what a real understory looks like. This is what happens when you don't exclude the deer. You get no recruitment into your forests. They're very important in new invasives like Japanese stiltgrass. Asian jumping worms are associated with too many deer. I went to the Great Smoky Mountains in the spring in May, and the first thing I noticed was they had great understory. That's what a healthy understory looks like in a healthy forest. So I asked them, how are you managing your deer? And they said, we don't manage the deer at all. And I said, well, why not? I mean, how can you have all this understory? Well, what they do have is black bears, healthy population of black bears. They've got bobcats and they've got coyotes. They don't have wolves, but those predators are enough to keep the deer populations under the carrying capacity, and that's what we need to do. Of course, there's other serious downsides to deer overabundance, not just wrecking recruitment in the forest, but they've created a Lyme disease issue. I've had Lyme disease 5 times, so I get it, because they are one part of the Lyme disease tick cycle. So we got to control our deer. How do we do that? You can put the predators back. I'm all for it, but a lot of people are not going to let that happen. You can hire sharpshooters that come into your neighborhood, and people are doing that. It's expensive. They'll take, they can take dozens of deer, but it's often just about half of the population, so it doesn't really control it. Or we can switch to market hunting. This is what Bern Blassie at Cornell says we should do. Of course, market hunting is what controlled those pesky bison and the passenger pigeon, the Carolina parakeet. Market hunting really works. So if people get paid to hunt deer, they will control the population. But we got to change some rules for that to happen. What do we do in the meantime? Put a cage around your plants. Any plant you want to keep, you've got a cage, at least where I live, or the deer will kill it. What about cropland? Got a lot of cropland out there, 410 million acres of cropland. That's the light green areas here. And, we're not going to get rid of that, but there's a lot of things we can do to our agricultural areas that will increase their impact on biodiversity. We can manage the roadsides properly. We can put hedgerows back where they used to be, or at least in many places. We can add prairie strips to our fields, and we can minimize our use of neonicotinoid insecticides. The monarch butterfly, of course, is red listed now. We've lost 96% of them or something. It's a terrible year for monarchs. Cindy and I drove across the country in July, out and back, and we saw one monarch. That's not good. Why is that? This is why that is. The roadsides that used to be, quote, weeds, milkweed, asters, goldenrod, evening primrose, all those weeds that supported not just the monarch, but also our native bees, have been converted into grass, into lawns. It's the new status symbol for agriculture. So not only did we lose the biodiversity value of our ag fields, now we have to mow them, and we're putting even more carbon into the atmosphere. But we can put it back, and people are doing that. They're doing that in Iowa. They're starting to do that in other places. Put the prairie plants back where they belong, and you can boost the biodiversity value over ag fields without sacrificing crop yield at all. Put hedgerows back. Now, I know we've got huge machinery. We can't do it everywhere, but there's a lot of places we can do it, and make sure they are comprised of native plants. What happens when a hedgerow is just non-natives? You lose the biodiversity value just about completely. We looked at the caterpillar populations in hedgerows in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware that were invaded by non-natives. So here's autumn olive and Japanese honeysuckle and multiflora rose, and compared them to hedgerows that were not invaded. And we found a 68% reduction in the number of caterpillar species in the invaded hedgerows, a 91% reduction in the abundance of those caterpillars, and a 96% reduction in the biomass, the amount of weight of energy in those hedgerows. So we're really talking about bird food here. You reduce bird food by 96%. No wonder our birds are in trouble. Okay, prairie strips, wonderful idea. Put these prairie strips right through the soybeans, right through the corn, and you orient them perpendicular to the flow of water off the property. Obviously, they're going to help the pollinators, but they also intercept topsoil loss, reducing it by 95%, reducing water pollution by 90%, because it's intercepting the pollutants before it gets to our waterways. And it's supported by USDA CREP program. So everybody wins, win, 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 win. And then finally, we've got to minimize our use of neonicotinoid, particularly seed coatings, which are used preventively. In other words, all the seeds have it, whether you have an insect problem or not. Interestingly, if you compare yield where you use seed coatings with yield where you don't, there's no boost in yield, which means we're doing it for nothing. Neonicotinoids are 7,000 times more toxic to insects than DDT was. So this is serious stuff here. Only 5% of the product is taken up by the plant. 95% washes off into the watershed or blows away on dust where it's doing who knows what. But remember, doing it for nothing. Let's stop that. And finally, rangeland. Huge amount of the country is in rangeland, 770 million acres in rangeland. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. But how we run those cattle is going to determine the biodiversity value of that entire chunk of land. This is an experimental range in Nebraska that Cindy and I went to. Those are cattle. It's not bison. Remember, all grasslands around the world co-evolve with grazers. They are supposed to have grazers on there. So having cattle on your grassland is not a bad thing if you do a few things. These are all sunflowers, by the way. This was a very healthy place. All of the prairie birds were there. It was great. But there's three things we need to do. We need to avoid overgrazing. We got to put the beavers back, believe it or not, and we got to keep the cows out of the streams. It turns out, particularly in the Southwest, that removing beavers, trapping them all out, is what destroyed rangeland. It wasn't overgrazing. Overgrazing was there too. But what happens when you take the beavers out? The streams become channelized with a rush of water. There's no beaver dam slowing it down. That drops the water table, and in the Southwest desertifies all the land around it so that they can't support the grass and the cattle. And so you put the beavers back, or beaver dam analogs, and rebuild the water table. Then you have healthy grasslands, but you got to keep the cows out of the streams because they eat the cottonwoods and they eat the willows, and that's where most of the biodiversity is. The important thing is these are all doable things. Okay, there's something that's common to each one of these conservation approaches, and that is whether or not they succeed depends on the decisions that you and I make. I had a student who was answering a part of a final exam a couple of years ago, Amanda Crandall, who said that while conservationists claim to be managing species and habitats, what we're really managing is people. This is a people problem. So we really are talking about changing the people culture, changing the culture from an adversarial relationship with nature to a collaborative relationship with nature. It's the only way forward. And the question is, can we actually do this? Well, my answer is yes. Of course we can do it. You don't have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. So many people recognize now that the earth has serious issues, but they all feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can do all the things we just talked about. One person can shrink the lawn. One person can modify their lights. One person can add a pollinator garden. They can remove the invasive plants from their properties. They can add keystone plants. They can fire Mosquito Joe. They can join Homegrown National Park. One person. You can totally transform the value of the ecological value of your property and enhance your local ecosystem rather than degrading it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You will get depressed. Just think about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They would love you as a volunteer. So I hope that Homegrown National Park will provide the motivation and the guidance for millions and millions and millions of people to tackle these conservation challenges. And whether or not we do tackle these conservation challenges is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. So please get on the map, join Homegrown National Park. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Tallamy. We've got Jenny Nelson here. We've got lots of great questions for you. But I want to begin by saying I'm kind of embarrassed about that lack of color on our Texas Homegrown National Park map. We need to work on that. So I'm glad you're here.
A little competition there too, yeah.
We Texans, we do things big. So, you know, we won't take long for us to get that sorted out. So, but we do have some unique challenges here. Maybe they're not so unique, but Sheila, she wants to plant an oak tree and she's worried about oak wilt. It's been a problem in North Central Texas for some time. And what do you have to say about that?
I have to say the opposite of what your arborist will tell you.
Okay.
What I hear all the time is don't plant oaks anymore because they'll get sick and die. I say plant more oaks than ever because there is resistance to oak wilt, to bacterial leaf scorch, to sudden death oak syndrome. There is resistance to all of those diseases. And what we have to do is favor those resistant trees so that they spread. There's also susceptibility. You're going to lose a lot of oaks. So we have to remove those susceptible genes, get the resistant plants into our landscapes. You know, if you have an oak tree that's resistant, those are the acorns that the jays are going to move and plant. Mm-hmm. So it will self-replicate. But if we stop planting oaks, we're never going to discover the resistance that's there. That's what we did with the chestnut blight. You know, oh, it's got chestnut blight, so the loggers cut them all down. And the tiny bit that were resistant were lost. So plant that oak. If it dies, plant another one. And in the meantime, even the small oaks, years and years and years before they die, are being very productive and supporting your local biodiversity.
Great. Richard is interested in soil, and he knows from your book that fertilizer can be problematic, and it certainly is in North Texas with all of our lawns. He said, when planting natives, do you recommend using composted soil from a local source, or do you just plant in the native soil? And you can take that, and I might add a couple things.
Yeah, you know, it depends somewhat on what you're starting with. So if your soil's highly degraded, like my soil, when I moved into our property, it was subsoil. There wasn't any topsoil there. But keep in mind, there are a couple of generalities here. That most of our native plants do not want a lot of fertilizer. They are adapted to low fertilizer conditions. That's particularly true with prairie plants. If you fertilize them, what you're really doing is encouraging the non-native weeds that like a lot of fertilizer. So minimizing fertilizer in and of itself is not bad. And adding fertilizer can be a real detriment. Can you inoculate your soil with you know, people say, well, I don't have the mycorrhizae and everything else. The best way to do that, let's say you are planting that oak tree and you're worried you don't have the proper mycorrhizae. Find an oak of the same species that's established someplace and get some soil from underneath that oak. And not a lot, in a little bit, you're inoculating it, and that works. That spreads very quickly. You know, I did an experiment back in the 80s. I don't even remember what the question was, but it was a greenhouse experiment where I wanted pots with plants with no mycorrhizae in it compared to pots with plants with mycorrhizae. And a guy from the plant science department said, well, how are you going to keep the mycorrhizae out of the control plant pots? I said, I won't put any in. He said, the spores are floating around in the air and they inoculate themselves. I said, oh, so it will. Your new plantings will inoculate themselves. Might take a little bit longer. If you add leaf litter that has been composted, it definitely speeds up the process. I did that at home with that subsoil. I just put leaf litter that the township had composted, and it worked really well. The downside is you are bringing in seeds of a lot of things you don't want when you do that. And that's probably how I got a lot of the Japanese stilt grass I've got. So that's serious.
Here in North Texas, we're really fortunate that our municipalities do recycle green waste. And we've got Texas Pure that is able to have huge mounds that are able to get the heat that you really need. It's a huge undertaking.
Great.
So if our local folks would check out Texas Pure and the similar folks, and just a 3 to 4 inch over the top of that awful sticky black clay yuck, then they're going to find very soon that they can grow any prairie plant very happily.
Yeah, great. Good.
Carol Greenhill says that sadly they have privet and nandina invading the native areas. And when she drives down the road, she sees these plants everywhere. She wants to know if she can cut the ones on the roadside.
I give her full permission.
I do too.
You know, that's called guerrilla landscaping.
Yeah, that's a new one.
The people
all right.
aren't taking care of that, so they're not going to get mad at you.
Crystal's got a great thing that we should do. She wants to know, does registering with you count towards any property tax reduction help? Which I think is a great idea. And maybe other states are doing it. Maybe California does that. Who knows? But I think we should suggest it. Everybody on this call, write your state congressman and let's do that. Nancy Riggs has a good point. Nancy she says, do the ginkgos sequester carbon?
Yes. They don't have biodiversity value. Yes, they're sequestering carbon, they're throwing shade. So, you know, they're not useless, but in terms of adding energy to your local food web, they're not.
They're just pretty. That's about it.
Yeah.
Let's see. An anonymous question here. They wants to know your thoughts on vegetable gardens and fruit trees that are non-natives. Have there been any scenarios where a crop for human consumption has become invasive or attracts invasive insects that cause problems?
Well, the cabbage white butterfly is an invasive insect and it's in everybody's garden. So yes, that has happened. But, you know, vegetable gardening, fruit tree gardening, those are necessary things. And gardening at home minimizes transportation costs. You get to control what goes on those plants. So I don't want to discourage vegetable gardening at home by any means. It's just something else to do with your property. I'm talking about all the rest of your property you don't know what to do with. That's where those natives can go.
With
apples and oranges.
Apples are okay. We do spray a lot of our peaches here. It's the only way you can get peach is pretty much in our area. But how do you feel about crepe myrtles and bark scale that they brought along with them? That was a local explosion.
Well, crepe myrtles, you know, it's another decoration, heavily used. It's a beautiful plant. When they're in bloom, honeybees do get some nectar out of them, which of course they're non-natives too. But so I would treat it as a decoration, not as something that's actually going to contribute to your local biodiversity. When you drive around and you see that 80% of the plants are crepe myrtles, that's when it's an issue. Use it as an accent rather than a dominant tree.
North Texans, are you listening? We have a lot of our local landscapers, we have problems with the bark scale and aphids. And so they come in with imidacloprid in the middle of a pollinator garden, you know, under that crepe myrtle. So we have to be very cautious with what we put on. Another question. We have a little water, Holly says we have a little water tray with a solar fountain, which is adorable, that the birds visit. Would the mosquito dunks harm them?
No,
No.
that's the beauty of mosquito dunks.
Great. Let's see, people are interested in this. Sarah asks, is there anything else you can add to the mosquito dunk bucket instead of straw, like excess leaves or sawdust? Anything else?
I don't know about sawdust. Leaves probably are fine. Even grass clippings should be okay. You're looking for organic material that's going to support algae and diatoms. I don't know about sawdust. I wouldn't do that.
Another anonymous question. Can we have the source of the data about the mosquitoes? My neighborhood contracts for spraying, even though it's been so dry, we've hardly had any this year, and data showing the harmful effects of spraying, as well as the inefficiency of spraying, would be helpful. What data I have found so far, they don't believe, even coming from me, someone with an advanced degree in ecology. Oh my God.
I've got a file of series of papers that I could send you.
If you want to send me that, then I will see if we can attach that to all of our attendees, because I think that's a big issue down here.
But you know what? The fact that he has to keep coming back and doing it again tells you he didn't control them the first time. So you've got your demonstration that it doesn't work.
That's right. That's right. Okay, so someone is sticking up for North Texas. Another anonymous person here, that we have 200 properties listed. Okay, so how many million people live in DFW, my friend? Okay, we can do better. We are going to do better. Carol says she's got several years of oak leaves in some areas with things such as mist flower, obedient plant, and attempts with other natives, and very little breakdown of the leaves. So how much of the leaves should I remove? It sounds like she's being really successful. I don't know that I would do anything, but.
Well, it takes oak leaves up to 3 years to break down. And particularly, it requires moisture. So you've been in a drought for a long time. I think the lack of moisture is really slowing things down. At the same time, those leaves are helping to protect whatever moisture you have left in the soil. It can't pile up too thickly. It shouldn't. The only place I saw unnaturally high leaf litter was at the Palmerton zinc smelting place in New Jersey. It spewed out zinc over everything, killed all the bacteria and that broke down leaves. And there literally were feet, the leaf litter was feet thick. So if your leaf litter is not breaking down at all, first of all, I'd be surprised, but you might, you don't have something killing your detritivores, do you?
Would it make sense, to treat it like as if it were a volcano mulch event? You're just going to bring it away from the base of the tree and give the tree a chance to breathe, and then everything else should be fine.
Yeah, I'm not worried about the tree, but people worry about their perennials and things. Can they make it up through the leaf litter? So,
okay. So our anonymous attendee wants to know, how do you address areas that have been planted in natives that were put in since 2017? So do you get credit in HNP for?
Oh, absolutely. And you even get credit for essentially pledging to do this. This doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
I don't want people to say, well, I'm not going to join until I've reduced my lawn by half, because that might be 10 years from now. So no, absolutely. Just sign up. This is part of the change the culture part. If you recognize that this is an important goal, you're in. That's what we're looking for.
Oh, I like that. So Carol lives on 5.5 acres that are in the Cross Timbers section of Texas. She's left much of her property as nature grew it. And she says, still, I don't see many various species. How do I locate the different species that may be here? That may take a while.
Yeah, I hear that a lot with the caterpillars. I don't see the caterpillars that you find. A lot of them are out at night. So look for your caterpillars with a flashlight at night, and you're going to find a lot more than during the day. They're hiding from the birds. Also don't look when it's 110 degrees out. They're doing the best they can to take cover. This is a terrible time of year or the worst time of year to look for birds because they finished reproducing and they're very quiet. They're actually there, but you don't hear or see them. So springtime or during migration is a great time to look for the birds. Where I live, the end of July, early August is the time to look for caterpillars, but you guys are, you're hotter and drier. So I would say maybe June-ish, if the birds are breeding earlier. You don't want to look during peak breeding season because they eat them all. And they're really hard to find. But you've got to look at when the different things are active.
And it might be good to contact your local master naturalists, and maybe you
Yeah.
can find a volunteer who'd be able to come out and walk the property with you and point out things that you didn't notice. We've got a lot of master naturalists on the call today, so their ears just perked up. There's another good question from our anonymous attendee. Would like thoughts on plants that are native to the area south of the US, but that are now adapted to warmer climates. So how do you feel on species creep?
Yeah, or assisted migration. I'm not a big fan of it. Well, first of all, climate change, you can say the Earth is gradually getting warmer as average temperatures, and that is true. But remember the freeze you guys had, 3 years ago?
Gosh,
Overboard that?
never forget it.
We have increased climate variability. That's what's really happening. And you start moving things up from the south, you get an event like that and they get killed. But the other thing is you're starting to remove them from all the creatures they co-evolved with. Then you're removing their importance. Even though they may live, they're going to live outside of their community. They're not going to be as contribute as much. Now, if you're talking about 50 miles or something, something from the Rio Grande moving up a little bit, that's okay. But taking something from Peru and putting it in your yard because it's going to be adapted, nah, that's not going to work.
So Jane loves the idea of planting native plants along the roads and highways, but one of the criticisms she's heard is that the insects will just be hit by cars.
Yeah, we actually did a study with that, and there's certainly truth to it. So it depends on how wide the verge is. The wider, the better, and you want to plant away from the road. Planting our medians is almost certainly not a good idea because there's no way the insects can get to the median plantings without crossing traffic. The real question is, are we producing more insects than we're killing? And the jury's still out on that. Our study suggested that avoiding the high-speed major highways is probably a good idea, but there's a lot of back roads that can be planted very effectively where the traffic is slower and a lot more infrequent. Those are the areas we should start with.
Crystal is very excited, and she says, "I have beavers!"
Hey,
Right. So congratulations to Crystal. Well done. Another person, Mr. Deans or Ms. Deans, early in the presentation, you said to remove all invasive plants. And I'm wondering whether all means all. For example, does that mean things like blue mist flower, which is a plant pollinators enjoy a lot? There are a lot of blue mist flowers. So there's native ones and not natives.
yeah. Let's be clear on the definition of invasive. I didn't say remove all non-natives. I said remove all invasives. So an invasive species is a non-native species that is aggressively displacing the natives. That ginkgo is not an invasive species. It's non-native, but it's just going to sit there. And that's true for a lot of ornamentals. It's true for, zinnias and a lot of things that the pollinators are getting good nectar from. So I'll stick with it. If it's truly invasive, it's an ecological tumor. And you might ask yourself, how many tumors do you want to leave in your body? You do want to get them all because they just keep multiplying.
Right. Well, so for example, we have a wildflower that just came in, field scabies, that's what it is. And it came in on a seeding that a local municipality did. And now it's everywhere and it's taking our prairie remnants and to bits. Even though the pollinators love it, it's wreaking havoc.
All right, let's talk briefly about that. The generalist pollinators love it.
Right.
We've got 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. So you're talking about what, the 1,500 species of bees will not be able to use that plant for reproduction. And that's the key. If we plant for specialists, the generalists will use them too. But if we only plant for generalists, you lose the specialists. So just because you see a honeybee or a few bumblebees going there doesn't mean you're actually helping a lot of pollinators.
Right. And then that invasive is taking up good real estate,
Right.
where we'd like our other things to be. So that's great. Good question there. Was your wife, Diane wants to know, was your wife able to get rid of the sticky vines and plants that were on your land after it grew back from farming? She's fighting greenbrier, dewberries, trifoliate orange, privet, and others. And she's not having any luck just mowing.
No, mowing does not kill the rootstocks. No, we did not mow at all. We did it individually. She cutters. She doesn't like herbicide, so it was really a matter of hacking. You know what a wonderful tool is a mattock. So it looks like a pickaxe, but it's got the broad base at the, and even, a good sized multiflora rose bush or even autumn olive tree, you can whack out those roots and no herbicide, and then it's gone. So it was always very satisfying to pile up the big bodies because it looked like it really done something. But yes, she's able to get rid of it. It's constant. The problem is, of course, they keep reseeding in from our neighbors who haven't gotten rid of them, but then they're small. So you got to stay after it. And it is a huge amount of work, but it's very satisfying and it does work.
Roy Diblick has that Dutch push-pull hoe, helps get them when they're small.
Yeah.
2 seconds, no bending. Let's see. Oh, Crystal says, comes back, the beaver woman. She said, sorry, let me rephrase. I have beavers. What next? So she's an overachiever. She wants to have beavers. What does she go for next? Fox?
What next to get?
Yeah.
How much land does she have? I mean, if you build a diverse landscape with the native plants and heavy on the keystone plants, things will come in over time. We're still recording new species at our house, and it's been 22 years at this point. So what next is you get to see what's going to come in. It's fun. We added a new species, 2 new species of breeding birds this year. We got red-shouldered hawk with a nest on our property, and we got black and white warblers nesting on our property, really south of where they should be, but then I saw them feeding their young. So that's exciting. Just keep watching. That's what's next.
Awesome. Deanne, she remembers the Strip Prairie project being around back in the 80s to help control erosion. I was not aware of that. I think that's a great thing, and we should try and put those in many different areas.
I didn't remember in the 80s. So.
Colleen says to you, you're the Rachel Carson of our generation. Thank you.
Oh, I hope I live longer than Rachel did, but but thank you. That's a real compliment.
Our anonymous guest says, thank you, Dr. Tallamy. Have you looked into the benefits of individuals adopting plant-based diets and how these might intersect with our efforts toward conservation and ecological restoration? Cheers.
Well, there is no doubt that the production of beef around the world is a major environmental issue. The amount of land you're either grazing the beef directly or you're growing corn or soybeans to feed them later on. So reducing beef consumption here and everywhere else would impact biodiversity tremendously. It's one of the major causes. It also adds methane to greenhouse gases. Of course, beef's really popular. So we've been talking about plant-based diets for 40, 50 years now, and sure, do it, and it'll be great, but it's a tough one.
Mm-hmm. Well, the marketplace may do that for us as the prices keep going up. So Angie says, is there somewhere she can read about strategies you found that work to eliminate those invasives like privet? She feels really hopeless sometimes. So if you,
Yeah, I'm actually getting ready tomorrow. I'm handing in a draft of my next book, and it's answering questions just like that.
Oh,
That's what
this
the
is great.
entire book is. But I can briefly tell you right now, Privet, what I would do, you can do the Matic, whacking it out. That works well. If you don't want to do that, you cut it off at the base and paint it with an herbicide, oil-based herbicide that will get in and kill the roots. You're using very little material, and that works.
Let's see. Nancy says she's heard that bur oak and white oak are more resistant to oak wilt. I don't know. Is that?
Yeah, kind of depends on where you are. They're certainly more resistant to bacterial leaf scorch. So yes, some truth to that.
Carrie wants to encourage her neighbors to change the biodiversity of their yards and wants to know how she can influence them. And I would just say, do what you practice, walk the walk.
Be a good model. Yeah. It's hard. If your neighbor came over to you and said, you're not living the way I want you to, a lot of times that's a hard sell. Yeah, it depends on how well you know them, but be a positive role model. I get emails from people saying, I'm known as the butterfly lady. All the kids in the neighborhood come to my yard because they love it. That's the type of positive model that we want. And then other people say, oh, I want to be the butterfly lady. But telling them they're not living right and they got to be like you is probably not going to work.
Yeah, and share your native plants. People often don't know where to get them. So if you just offer them as a gift to your neighbor, they might be more willing to plant it. Who knows?
Yeah.
Let's see. Carol wants to know what your thoughts are on watering and planting new things when we have our concrete soil that doesn't allow tiny water to get in. How do you?
Well, you don't do it during the summertime.
Yeah.
First of all, you've got to amend that soil a little bit, get some organics into it, so it's not pottery, and that will help. And that's where that leaf litter and other organics can really help. But Texas had plants over all of it before we came in and modified it. So if we can get the plants back, the soil will support them if we do it correctly.
Great. Let's see. Danielle has a small lot, about 50 by 20. She has hackberries. She's got a pool. They're growing by the pool. Within 5 feet, she hasn't had the heart to cut them out or to cut them down. So now she has 3. Is there a way to manage their height or will it control their roots? What do you do with your hackberries that are spots they're not supposed to be?
What I do is plant them. I went out of my way to get 4 hackberries and plant them. It's a great tree, good native tree. So I don't know if you've got an overabundance of hackberries down there, but it's a desirable plant for biodiversity.
Okay.
If they're everywhere and you want to keep them away from your pool, then yeah, cut it down.
Yeah, I think what people are concerned about, they want to do the right thing, but they're worried that there's a sense of guilt when you have a human need that you feel that pull to do something natural. How do we
compromise? Compromise is not a dirty word.
That's great.
You've got to live in a way that you're happy with. The object is to find a way that other things can be happy with it too. If you've got some hackberries on your property, you can remove some. It's okay.
Okay. Here's, I think, a great question. Jenny says, not this Jenny, but a different Jenny. She says, are there any landscape architects that have embraced these concepts, and how can we follow these folks who are leading design in that area?
Yeah. Yes, there are. We need a lot more. I have talked to the National Convention of ASLA, the Association of Landscape Architects. Landscape designers push back a little bit more than landscape architects because they're more married to particular plants. They don't want to give them up. But it is moving in the right direction. What we really need to train. Most people don't garden. Most people just hire somebody. They hire their lawn care industry, and we need to have a new industry called ecological landscapers, where you just hire them. They'll know what plants need to go in there. They'll know how to install them. They'll know how to maintain them. They'll know how to use grass effectively as a cue for care. And you can, go to the soccer game and it'll be okay. They'll do it for you. That's where we need to go. The real place we need to go is to have developers create the right landscape in the beginning. And then if the homeowner wants to change it, it's up to them. Now, developers create it all wrong and the homeowner has to change it. And that's just totally backwards.
Right. Would you say Thomas Rayner and Claudia West have a book that might help this person get going, planting in a post-wild
world? Yeah. And also Larry Weiner has a book called.
Right.
But yes, Thomas Rayner is not 100% native, but he certainly knows how to use plants effectively, he says lawn should be an area rug, not wall-to-wall carpeting. He says a lot of great things. And Claudia West is right there with him. Excellent plantsmen. They know how to use plants effectively and achieve that aesthetic value that most people are looking for. So definitely.
Let's see. Kathy has 121 acres and she's getting covered with thousands of honey locust trees. She says we'll never be able to by ourselves to get rid of this tree. Is there any outside help available to control this obnoxious, dangerous, invasive? We're hoping to leave this land in a conservancy.
Yeah.
You thought on that too. Whoa.
Well, you'd have to, I don't know the local help, but it's land management. And we do, we are gardening the world. We have to manage all of it. So, yeah.
Kathy, if you'll email summer speakers series at ccmgatx.org, I'll see who we can find to help you get more information. Let's see, Nick in East Texas has areas of native grasses and wildflowers alongside the peach and the apple trees. It said this summer has been crazy with grasshopper population explosion and damage to the garden and the orchard have been out of control. What do you recommend to protect orchards and gardens as he doesn't want to mow all of his native grasses down? Do we need to just call in the birds?
Yes, call in the birds. It's interesting. There are other parts of the country saying, where are my grasshoppers? I haven't seen a grasshopper forever. They're measuring neonicotinoids in rain, and they're suspecting that's an issue. But up in Montana and Wyoming, they're worried that neonics are blowing in from Idaho with the potatoes. I've got very few grasshoppers at home and I don't know where the heck they went. So maybe they're all down in Texas with you, but you've got an embarrassment of riches there. And I don't know, I'd hesitate to say mow all of your grasses, but.
What about, do bluebirds eat grasshoppers?
Yes, they do. I got pictures of it.
Yeah, so down here, I would say put up some bluebird boxes and let them go to town. Let's see. Let's talk about what apartment living people can do. What do you see?
If you picture an apartment building as a big granite outcrop, and let's say there's plants growing in the cracks, that's what the balconies are. Will things use those plants? Absolutely. Because right now the wildlife just sees it as a big rock. And we've got nothing there that would be productive. So there are two things. You can put plants in containers on your balcony, or I could say, or look at the grounds of your apartment building. If there are trees out there, ask the superintendent, can I adopt one of these trees? I'll bet there's no bed under it. I'll bet that, and the superintendent is not going to want to do anything that creates more labor. So say, I'm going to adopt this tree. If everybody in the apartment complex adopted one tree on that landscape and treated it correctly, put the soft landing bed underneath it so the caterpillars that develop on that tree can fall down and actually pupate, keep the grass away from it. It's labor a little bit, but it's your fun gardening project, even though you don't own that property. That could transform that landscape into something that's valuable that it probably isn't now. Plus adding all those balcony plants.
So we have a comment from Melanie, and she knows her Texas trees, and she's saying that the honey locust is actually a native tree. So we should be really kind to that property. It has lots of native trees.
You're not talking about invasive acacia, is she?
I'm not sure. Well, we're gonna look. I'll look into that after we're done today. Lots of comments about how they appreciate your time today and all the good information that you shared. And one really smart person said, "Tell us about the children's book."
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know who
And
that's.
it wasn't me. Someone else
Oh, okay.
picked up on that. So tell us all about it.
Okay, well, I don't want to take any credit for this. People have always said, you got to go to schools and talk to the kids. And I don't disagree with that, but there are a lot of schools out there, and there's only one of me. But Timber Press said, let's make a young reader's version of Nature's Best Hope. And they hired a woman, Sarah Thompson, I think her name was, to rewrite it in the language of middle schoolers. And I had to edit it and everything else, but she really stuck to it. She did not water it down. And that's what the young reader's version is. The object is to get this into the school system. And it's out there. We'll see. This will be the first school year. We'll see how much it's going to be used. But the only thing I hesitate about a little bit is I don't want to say, well, we're off the hook. We're just going to let our kids solve this. We don't have another generation to wait. And the demographic that is most powerful in this conservation movement are retired baby boomers. They have the time, they have the money, and they're looking for projects. Whereas kids don't own the property. Yes, they need to know this. They need to be trained in it. It's got to become part of the culture from the earliest ages. But we're not going to push it off onto them. We all have to do it, every single age group. So anyway, the young readers version's out there. It's cheap. If you have grandchildren, give it to them, and we'll see how it goes.
Right. Yep. You can get ready for Christmas. It's coming.
Christmas.
So if I know that you're a busy guy and you've got to go out and do research so we can learn more. Okay. And you can share it with us when we ask you back again, which I know that we will. Any last message for us down here in Texas where it's hotter than you know what?
Yeah. The message I always like to end with is the personal responsibility, the fact that this is not about whether you're a tree hugger or not. It's about whether you live on this planet, and the fact that we all totally require healthy ecosystems means we're all responsible for being a good steward of them. So embrace that personal responsibility. See what you can do, even if it's as simple as voting, because voting determines a lot of what's happening in this country environmentally. So I'll leave you with that.
Well, I'm going to invite Barron back. He's our current president of Collin County Master Gardeners Association.
Dr. Tallamy, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. Time well spent for us. I know each one of us is going to take something away from this and use it going forward. For everybody that participated with us today, thank you for joining. In the next week, we will be sending you an unlisted YouTube link that will give you access to this presentation, and that will be out there for about 2 weeks. We hope that you have enjoyed our inaugural summer speaker series. Please be sure to fill out the post-event survey and let us know what topics and what people you might want to see next year. Again, thank you for participating in this spectacular summer speaker series hosted by the Collin County Master Gardener Association. Be safe out there, stay cool, wear your hat, wear your sunblock, and hydrate. We want to see you again next year. See you then. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much, Dr. Tallamy.